The air in the courtroom felt like it had been recycled 1,000 times. Heavy with the smell of old paper and the bitter scent of cheap coffee, Alina sat at the mahogany table, her fingers tracing a deep scratch in the wood that someone else had left behind in a moment of similar desperation. Across the aisle, the man she had spent 15 years with didn't even look her way. He was busy whispering to his legal team, a group of men in suits that cost more than Elena's first 3 cars combined. When the judge finally spoke, the words didn't feel like a beginning or an end. They felt like a subtraction. One by one, the life Alina had helped build was peeled away. The house, with the wraparound porch? Gone. The shared savings account? Drained by legal fees and offshore investments she had never been told about. The retirement fund? Negotiated down to a fraction of its value. And regarding the 1961 Cadillac Series 62, the judge said, his voice droning on, as per the defendant's motion. The vehicle is awarded to the plaintiff, Alina Vance. In its current AHS's condition, her ex-husband let out a small, sharp huff of air, a laugh he tried to hide behind a cough. He knew that car was a carcass. It had been sitting in his father's barn for 30 years. A rusted-out shell of steel that didn't even have a functioning engine. To him, giving her the Cadillac was the ultimate insult. It was a 5,000-pound paperweight that she would have to pay someone to haul away. It was his way of saying, I am giving you nothing but more work. Alina didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just nodded. She remembered seeing that car once, years ago, under a layer of dust so thick you could write your name in it. Even then, through the grime and the flat tires, there was something about the tilt of its tail fins that looked like it was trying to fly. 2 days later, the tow truck dropped the car off in front of a small, cramped garage Alina had rented on the edge of town. It was the only place she could afford now. The driver unhooked the chains with a sympathetic look. You sure you want this, lady? He asked, wiping grease on a rag. The scrapyard down the road would give you $500 for the metal. Save you the headache, I'm sure, Alina said, though her voice wavered. She stood alone on the cracked asphalt as the tow truck pulled away. The Cadillac looked even worse in the daylight. The peacock blue paint had faded into a ghostly, chalky gray. The chrome bumpers were pitted with rust, and the interior smelled like decades of trapped heat and forgotten secrets. It was a broken thing. It's cast aside by a man who only valued things that were shiny and new. Alina walked up to the driver's side door. The handle was cold and heavy. It took a firm yank to get it to open, the hinges screaming in a high-pitched protest. She sat down on the bench seat, and a cloud of dust erupted from the fabric. Dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the cracked windshield, she gripped the steering wheel, the original, thin, ivory-colored rim. It was huge, like the wheel of a ship. For the first time in 2 years, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like a blank page. It's just you and me, she whispered. She spent the first week just cleaning. She didn't have the money for a mechanic. So she bought a used shop manual and spent her nights reading about carburetors and drum brakes. She scrubbed the seats with vinegar and water until her knuckles bled. She spent hours picking out the debris that mice had left behind in the glove box. It was during the second week that things started to feel strange. Alina was working on the floorboards. The carpet was a nightmare matted, damp-smelling, and fused to the metal in some places. She was using a flathead screwdriver to pry up a particularly stubborn section. Near the passenger's side kick panel when she felt a thunk. It wasn't the sound of hitting a rusted floor. It was the sound of hollow metal hitting something solid. She paused, her heart skipping a beat. She pushed the screwdriver deeper, peeling back a layer of heavy insulation that looked like it had been glued down with industrial-grade resin. Underneath wasn't more rust. It was a steel plate, held in place by 4 mismatched screws that didn't look like they belonged to a 1960s General Motors factory. Alina's breath hitched. She went to her small toolbox and found a driver that fit. One by one, she backed the screws out. Her hands were shaking. This car had been in her ex-husband's family for decades. His father had been a quiet man, a local accountant who never traveled, never spent money, and lived a life of absolute, boring routine. She lifted the plate. Tucked into a custom-carved cavity in the floor was a heavy oilskin pouch. Tied tightly with a leather cord, it was perfectly preserved. Shielded from the moisture and the road salt of the last 60 years, Alina pulled the pouch out and sat back on her heels. The garage was quiet, save for the ticking of a cooling light bulb overhead. She untied the cord. Inside was a thick stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. But underneath the letters, wrapped in a piece of faded silk, was a heavy brass key with a numbered tag, C63, and beneath that, a small, black ledger filled with columns of numbers, dates, and names that Alina recognized instantly. They were the names of the founding partners of the firm where her husband worked, but the dates were wrong. These entries were from 1962. Years before the firm was supposed to have even existed. She opened the first letter. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, and frantic. If you are reading this, it means I didn't make it to the border, but the car did. Do not trust the lawyers. They aren't building a business. They are burying the truth. The Cadillac is the only thing they can't search without a warrant they'll never get. Everything is in the walls. Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty garage. She looked at the car, the worthless settlement, scrap her husband had laughed at. He hadn't just given her a car. He had accidentally handed her the one thing that could destroy his entire world. The silence in the garage felt different now. Before it was the silence of a woman who had lost everything. Now it was the heavy, buzzing silence of someone who had just stumbled onto a live wire. Alina sat on the cold concrete floor, the oilskin pouch heavy in her lap. The ledger was open to a page dated November 1963. The names written in faded ink were pillars of the community judges, senators, and the senior partners who had mentored her ex-husband. Beside each name was a dollar amount that made her head spin. She looked back at the Cadillac. For months, she had seen it as a burden, a heavy metal reminder of her failed marriage. Now, the car looked like a vault. She realized that her ex-husband's family hadn't kept this car because of some sentimental attachment to vintage steel. They had kept it because it was a hiding place, and because her husband had been so blinded by his own desire to humiliate her. He had handed her the keys to his family's darkest secrets. Just to save a few dollars on the divorce settlement, Alina stood up, her legs stiff. She knew she couldn't stay in the garage. If her ex-husband realized what he had done, he wouldn't just send a lawyer. He would come himself. She carefully tucked the ledger and the letters back into the pouch and hid them inside an old cooler she used for her lunches. She needed to know more about Clara. The woman who had written those frantic letters. She spent the next 3 days at the local library. Tucked away in the back corner where the microfilm machines lived, she didn't want to use her home computer. Her ex-husband still had access to their shared internet account, and he was the type of man who checked logs just to stay in control. She searched through the archives from the early 60s. Finally, she found a small headline from 1964. Local secretary missing, foul play suspected. The woman's name was Clara Moretti. She had worked for a small accounting firm, the same firm that eventually grew into the legal giant Elena's husband now ran. The article said Clara had vanished overnight, leaving behind a young daughter and an empty apartment. The case had gone cold within weeks. Alina felt a lump in her throat. She looked at the photo of Clara in the newspaper. She had a kind face, with eyes that looked like they had seen too much. Alina realized she wasn't just fighting for her own future anymore. She was holding the evidence of a woman who had been silenced decades ago. Returning to the garage that night, Alina felt a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just cleaning the Cadillac. She was searching it. She began to take the car apart with a precision she didn't know she possessed. She removed the door panels, her fingers trembling as she felt behind the window cranks. She unscrewed the dashboard. Every time a screw turned, she expected to find another secret. In the trunk, behind the spare tire well, she found it. It wasn't more papers. It was a small velvet-lined box tucked into a crevice of the frame. Inside was a collection of high-end jewelry pearls, a diamond brooch, and a heavy gold watch. But tucked under the velvet was a small, handwritten note for the girl. "If I don't make it, find the man in the blue house by the river." Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. The girl had to be Clara's daughter. If she was still alive, she would be in her 60s now. But Elena's progress didn't go unnoticed. The next morning, As she was pulling into the garage, she saw a familiar black SUV idling at the curb. Her heart dropped. It was her ex-husband. He stepped out of the car, looking polished and arrogant in a gray wool coat that cost more than her rent. "Alina," he said, his voice dripping with that fake concern he used in front of judges. "I heard you've been spending all your time in this dump. It's pathetic, really. I came to offer you a deal. I'll take the Cadillac off your hands. I'll give you $10,000 for it cash. You can move into a real apartment and stop playing mechanic." Alina gripped her keys so hard they bit into her palm. She knew him. He didn't give away money out of the goodness of his heart. He had realized something was missing. Maybe he had found an old record, or maybe his father had mentioned the hidden compartment on his deathbed. "The car isn't for sale," Alina said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Don't be a fool," he snapped, the mask of kindness slipping. "It's a pile of junk. I'm doing you a favor. If it's junk, why do you want it back so badly?" she asked. His eyes narrowed. For a second, she saw a flash of genuine fear in him. It was the look of a man who realized his empire was built on sand. He didn't say another word. He just got back into his SUV and drove away, the tires screeching on the pavement. Alina knew she was out of time. She couldn't stay in the garage anymore. She spent the rest of the night bolting the Cadillac back together. The engine still didn't run, but she didn't need it to. She called a long-distance transport company, one that didn't ask questions, and told them she needed a car moved to a private farm 3 states away. A place owned by her cousin who didn't even know her ex-husband existed, as she watched the Cadillac being loaded onto the flatbed trailer in the middle of the night. She felt a strange connection to the car. It had been a vessel for a woman's fear in 1963, and now it was a vessel for her own survival. She checked the oilskin pouch one last time. She had the ledger, the letters, and the jewelry. But there was one thing she hadn't investigated yet, the brass key with the tag, C63. It looked like a key to a safe deposit box. She looked at the coordinates written in the back of the ledger. They pointed to a location across the ocean. In a small village in Italy, where Clara, Moretti's family, had originated. Alina realized that the divorce hadn't been the end of her life. It had been the opening of a door. She went home, packed a single suitcase, and bought a one-way ticket to Milan. She didn't know if she would find the truth or if she was walking into a trap. But for the first time in 15 years, she was the one behind the wheel. The secret in the Cadillac had changed her destiny. But she was the one who would decide how the story ended. The plane touched down in Milan. Just as the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, Alina hadn't slept for more than an hour at a time during the long flight over the Atlantic. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cold, sharp eyes of her ex-husband or the rusted tail fins of the Cadillac. She felt like a different person than the woman who had sat in that courtroom only weeks ago. That woman was a victim of a bad marriage. This woman was a hunter, stepping out of the airport. The air felt different, crisper, and filled with the smell of espresso and diesel. She didn't have much luggage. She had learned over the last few years that the more things you own, the more things can be taken away from you. She carried her small bag and the oilskin pouch, which she had kept hidden inside a false lining in her coat. The brass key, marked C63, sat in her pocket. A heavy weight that seemed to thrum against her leg with every step. She rented a small, beat-up car, nothing like the grand Cadillac she had left behind, and began the drive north. Her destination was a village called Malnate, tucked away near the Swiss border. According to the old ledger she had found in the car, this was where Clara Moretti's family had come from. It was also where the coordinates led. The drive was beautiful, but Alina could hardly focus on the scenery. Her mind was spinning. Why had an accountant's daughter from a small American town hidden a fortune in jewelry and a ledger of bribes? And why had her husband's family kept that car hidden in a barn for half a century? The pieces were there, but they didn't fit together yet. She arrived in Malnate in the late afternoon. The town was a maze of cobblestone streets and ancient stone buildings that looked like they had been growing out of the earth for 1,000 years. She found a small inn run by an elderly woman who spoke very little English but had kind eyes. Alina didn't use her real name when she checked in. She was learning to be careful. After a quick meal of bread and local cheese, Alina pulled out the map. The coordinates from the ledger pointed to a spot about 3 miles outside of the town center. Near the banks of a river that fed into Lake Como, the blue house by the river, the note had said, she decided to walk. She needed the movement to calm her nerves. As she followed the winding path along the water, the sound of the rushing river filled her ears. It was a peaceful sound, a stark contrast to the loud, aggressive world she had left behind. She walked for nearly an hour before she saw it. It wasn't a grand villa. It was a modest 2-story house, tucked behind a grove of olive trees. The stucco was cracked and peeling, but you could still see the faint, faded remains of blue paint. It looked tired, as if it had been waiting for someone for a very long time. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She approached the front gate, which was made of rusted iron and tangled with vines. She pushed it open, the metal groaning, just like the hinges of the Cadillac had. She walked up the stone path and hesitated at the door. What was she going to say? "Hello? I found a secret compartment in an old car, and I think your mother might have been a whistleblower." It sounded insane. Before she could knock, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, perhaps in her mid-60s, wearing a thick wool sweater and holding a pruning shear. She had the same eyes as the woman in the newspaper clipping from 1964. "You took a long time," the woman said in a low, raspy voice. Her English was accented but clear. Alina froze. "You were expecting someone?" The woman stepped back, gesturing for Alina to enter. "My mother told me that one day the Cadillac would come home. Or at least, the person who cared enough to fix it would. She said the car was a test. Only someone who valued the things that others threw away would ever find what was hidden inside." The inside of the house was warm and smelled of dried herbs. The woman introduced herself as Lucia. She was Clara's daughter, the girl mentioned in the note. As they sat at a small wooden table, Alina placed the oilskin pouch on the surface. "I found this," Alina said quietly. "In the floorboards." Lucia reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the weathered leather. Tears welled up in her eyes. "She died shortly after she sent me away to live with my grandmother here in Italy. They told me it was an accident. A car crash. But I always knew. She was trying to protect me from the men she worked for." Lucia explained that Clara hadn't just been a secretary. She had been a brilliant woman who noticed that the law firm wasn't just handling money, they were laundering it for some of the most powerful people in the state. When she tried to go to the authorities, she realized the authorities were on the payroll. So she did the only thing she could. She stole the evidence, hid it in the one place they wouldn't look a car they considered a toy, and planned her escape. "But she didn't make it," Lucia whispered. "She was caught before she could reach the ship. But the car? The car was already on its way to the port, disguised as a gift for a business associate." Lena felt a surge of anger. The business associate had been her ex-husband's grandfather. He had kept the car, knowing it held secrets, but he had never been able to find them. He had passed the car down like a cursed heirloom, a secret hidden in plain sight. "The key," Alina said, pulling the brass key from her pocket. "What does it open?" Lucia looked at the key and then at a small framed photo on the mantel. It was a picture of Clara standing in front of a bank in Lugano, Switzerland. "My mother didn't just hide evidence," Lucia said. "She hid the one thing that could take them all down. A second ledger, a digital-age secret in an analog world, and a fund she established for the victims of their greed. But to get to it, we have to go to the bank together. You have the car's title and the key. I have the bloodline." Lena realized that her journey wasn't just about her own divorce anymore. It was about finishing the job Clara had started 60 years ago. But as they spoke, a dark car pulled into the gravel driveway outside. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. Elena's blood ran cold. Her ex-husband hadn't just followed her. He had tracked her. "We have to go," Elena said, grabbing Lucia's arm. Now, the sound of the car tires on the gravel outside the blue house felt like a physical blow to Elena's chest. She looked at Lucia, whose face had gone pale. her hand still resting on the old oilskin pouch. For a moment, time seemed to stretch thin. Alina realized that the safety she thought she had found in this quiet Italian village was an illusion. Her ex-husband was not a man who let things go. He didn't care about the Cadillac as a car. He cared about the power it represented. To him, Alina was just a loose end that needed to be tied off. "Is there a back way out?" Alina whispered, her voice tight. Lucia nodded toward a heavy wooden door behind the kitchen. "The cellar leads to the old vineyard path. It's steep, and the ground is uneven, but it's hidden from the main road." Alina grabbed the pouch and the brass key. She didn't have time to pack her things or even think about a plan. She just knew they couldn't be caught here. If her ex-husband's people found them with the ledger and the key, the truth would be buried forever. And Lucia would never get the closure she deserved. They slipped through the cellar door, just as a heavy knock echoed through the front of the house. The air in the cellar was cool and smelled of damp earth and old wine. Alina led the way, holding Lucia's hand to steady the older woman as they navigated the dark, narrow stairs. They emerged into the twilight, the shadows of the olive trees providing a thin layer of cover. "We can't take your car," Lucia breathed, her chest heaving from the exertion. "They will have seen it. They will be watching the main roads back to Milan." "Then we go to Switzerland," Alina said, looking toward the mountains that loomed in the distance. "You said the bank is in Lugano. That's less than an hour from here if we take the back roads." Lucia pointed toward a small, rusted tractor shed at the edge of the property. Inside sat an old, beat-up Fiat that looked like it hadn't been driven in years. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, much like the Cadillac had been. "It's my nephew's," Lucia said. "He keeps it here for when he visits." "The keys are under the seat." Alina didn't hesitate. She climbed into the driver's seat. The interior was cramped and smelled of gasoline, a far cry from the spacious, leather-scented cabin of the 1961 Cadillac. She turned the key, and the engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life with a noisy rattle. It wasn't elegant, but it moved. As they pulled away from the shed, Alina looked back in the rearview mirror. She saw the two men in suits standing on Lucia's porch. One of them was on a cell phone, gesturing wildly. They hadn't seen the Fiat yet, but it was only a matter of time. The drive toward the border was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Alina kept the headlights off as long as she could, navigating the winding mountain passes by the faint light of the moon. Beside her, Lucia was silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Why did your mother do it?" Alina asked, trying to break the suffocating tension. She must have known how dangerous these people were. Lucia looked down at her hands. "My mother believed that a secret is a poison. She saw what those men were doing, how they were stealing the futures of ordinary families to build their own empires. She used to say that the law is only as good as the people who stand behind it. When she realized the people behind it were corrupt, she decided to become the law herself. She didn't do it for the money. She did it because she couldn't live with the silence." Lena thought about her own life. For 15 years, she had lived in a different kind of silence. She had ignored the red flags, the late-night phone calls her husband took in private, and the way he looked down on anyone who didn't have a title or a massive bank account. She had been a silent partner in her own disappearance. "I spent so much time trying to be the perfect wife," Elena said, a bitter edge to her voice. "I thought if I just worked harder, if I was more supportive, he would eventually see me as a partner. But he never wanted a partner. He wanted a trophy he could control. When I stopped being easy to control, he decided to break me." "He didn't break you," Lucia said firmly. "He gave you the one thing he shouldn't have. He gave you a reason to fight back." He reached the Swiss border crossing just after midnight. Elena's heart hammered as she handed their passports to the guard. She expected a siren to go off, or for the black SUV to roar up behind them at any second. But the guard just glanced at the documents, stamped them, and waved them through. The air in Switzerland felt different, colder and more clinical. They arrived in Lugano as the city was waking up. The lake was a sheet of glass, reflecting the mountains and the expensive hotels that lined the shore. It was a place where money went to hide, a city of secrets. They waited in a small cafe until the bank opened. Alina felt exposed, sitting in her rumpled clothes among the well-dressed bankers and tourists. She kept the oilskin pouch tucked under her arm like it was a part of her body. When the doors finally opened, they walked into the lobby of a bank that looked more like a cathedral than a place of business. The floors were polished marble and the silence was heavy. Alina approached the teller and presented the brass key and the documents from the Cadillac. "I need to access a trust," she said, her voice sounding small in the vast room. "Box C63. The teller looked at the key, then at Alina, and finally at Lucia. He didn't say a word. He signaled to a man in a dark suit who led them into a private room in the back. "This account has been dormant for a very long time," the man said, his eyes scanning the paperwork. The instructions left by the original holder were very specific. They required the presence of a direct descendant and the physical key. He led them down into the vault. It was a labyrinth of steel and security cameras. They stopped in front of a small, nondescript box. Elena's hands shook as she inserted the brass key. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. Inside the box was a single, high-capacity data drive, modern addition to an old secretand, a stack of legal documents. But there was also something else. A small, velvet pouch. Alina opened the pouch and gasped. Inside was a collection of raw, uncut emeralds. They were beautiful, but it was the documents that mattered. They were the deeds to a series of properties, and a set of instructions for a whistleblower fund. Data drive contained decades of digital records that Clara's associates had continued to collect. Even after her death, it was a map of every bribe, every rigged election, and every laundered dollar that had built her ex-husband's firm. "It's over," Alina whispered. But as they turned to leave the vault, the heavy steel door began to swing shut. Standing in the doorway was her ex-husband. He wasn't wearing his expensive coat anymore. He looked disheveled, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and desperation. "Give me the drive, Alina," he said, his voice echoing off the cold metal walls. "You have no idea what you're holding. This isn't just about my firm. This goes higher than you can imagine. If you hand it over now, I can make sure you and the old woman get out of here. If you don't, well, accidents happen in the mountains all the time." Alina looked at the drive in her hand, then at Lucia, and finally at the man she had once loved. She realized she wasn't afraid of him anymore. He was just a small man hiding behind a big wall of lies. "The Cadillac was a getaway car," Alina said, her voice cold and clear. "And you're the one who's out of road." The air inside the bank vault felt thin and cold. But Elena's grip on the data drive was like iron. Her ex-husband stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocked by the harsh overhead lights of the hallway. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was losing a game he thought he had rigged from the start. He wasn't talking like a lawyer anymore. He was talking like a cornered animal. He tried to step forward, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished floor, but Alina didn't flinch. "You think this is about money?" Alina said, her voice echoing in the small steel room. "That's your mistake. It was always your mistake. You thought the Cadillac was just a piece of junk because it didn't have a price tag you liked? You thought I was just a wife you could discard because I didn't fit your plan anymore. But some things have a value you can't calculate." Lucia stood beside her, her presence a silent, steady weight. The older woman wasn't afraid. She had waited her entire life for this moment. She looked at the man who represented everything that had taken her mother away from her. And she didn't see a powerful enemy. She saw a coward. "The police are already on their way," Lucia said calmly. "The bank's security protocols were triggered the moment you tried to force your way into this private wing. In Switzerland, they take their privacy very seriously, even more seriously than you take your secrets." A flash of genuine panic crossed her ex-husband's face. He knew she was right. He turned and fled, the sound of his footsteps fading quickly down the corridor. He didn't have a plan anymore. He only had the instinct to run. But there was nowhere left for him to go. The paper trail in the Cadillac and the digital trail on the drive had already created a cage around him. Alina and Lucia didn't rush. They waited for the bank's security team to arrive. They handed over the evidence that related to the immediate threat, but Alina kept the data drive. She knew that the only way to ensure this story ended properly was to control the narrative herself. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Alina didn't go back to her old life. She didn't go back to that cramped apartment or the dusty garage. She stayed in Italy for a while, sitting on the porch of the blue house with Lucia, watching the sun set over the river. They talked about Clara not as a victim, but as a hero. They went through the old letters again, but this time they weren't looking for clues. They were looking for the woman, using the funds from the Swiss trust which had grown into a massive fortune over 60 years of compound interest. Lena began to build something new. She didn't want a mansion or a fleet of new cars. She wanted a legacy. She returned to the States and hired a team of investigators and lawyers who hadn't been corrupted by the old system. One by one, the names in the ledger began to face the light of day. Her ex-husband's firm collapsed within months as the evidence of decades of fraud became public. He didn't just lose his career. He lost the very thing he valued most, his reputation. He ended up in a small, gray cell, far cry from the glass-walled offices he used to inhabit, but the most important part of the story wasn't the downfall of the bad guys. It was the rebirth of the Cadillac. Alina had the car shipped to a world-class restoration shop. She told them she didn't want it to look like a museum piece. She wanted it to look like it was ready for a long drive. They spent a year on it. They sourced the original peacock blue paint, hand-stitched the leather seats, and rebuilt the engine until it hummed like a heartbeat. The day the car was finished, Alina drove it back to the small town where her divorce had started. She drove past the courthouse where she had been told she was getting nothing. She drove past the house she used to live in. People stopped on the sidewalks to stare. The Cadillac was a rolling piece of art, its chrome gleaming in the sun, its tail fins cutting through the air like wings. She pulled up to the nonprofit center. She had founded a place that provided legal aid and housing for women who had been left with nothing after long, difficult marriages. She named it Clara's house. In the lobby of the center, she didn't put a plaque or a statue. She parked the Cadillac right there in the center of the room. It was a reminder to every woman who walked through those doors that something broken and worthless could be the most powerful thing in the world if you were willing to look beneath the surface. Alina sat on the bumper of the car, looking at the ivory-colored steering wheel. She thought about the coordinates, the brass key, and the woman who had hidden her life's work in the floorboards of a car she hoped would reach her daughter. "We made it," Alina whispered, patting the cool blue metal of the hood. She wasn't a victim of a divorce anymore. She wasn't a woman who had been cheated out of her future. She was the guardian of a secret that had changed everything. As she looked out the window at the life she had built, she realized that her ex-husband had been right about one thing. The Cadillac was the most important thing she had ever owned. But he was wrong about why. It wasn't because of the money or the secrets. It was because the car had taught her that your destiny isn't something that is handed to you by a judge or a husband. It's something you find when you're brave enough to pick up a tool and start. Rebuilding, Alina took the keys out of her pocket, the modern car keys and the old brass key C63 that she now wore on a necklace. She walked out of the lobby and into the sunlight, leaving the doors open so the breeze could flow through. She had a lot of work to do, but for the first time in her life, she knew exactly where she was going. The morning sun hit the peacock blue hood of the Cadillac, creating a reflection so bright it looked like a pool of water resting in the middle of the driveway. Alina stood on her porch, a cup of coffee in her hands, watching the world wake up. It had been 5 years since the day she sat in that cold courtroom and was told her life was over. Now, looking out at the gardens of the estate, she had turned into a sanctuary. She realized that her life hadn't ended, that Diet had simply shed its old, rusted skin. She walked down the steps, her boots crunching on the gravel. Every morning, she spent a few minutes with the car. It wasn't just a machine to her anymore. It was a silent witness to her transformation. She ran her hand over the side mirror, feeling the smooth, cool chrome. She remembered the grease under her fingernails and the smell of old dust that used to fill her lungs. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, yet they were more real to her than the 15 years she had spent playing the role of the perfect, invisible wife. Inside the house, the phone rang. It was the director of the foundation she had built. "Alina, we have a new arrival," the voice said. "She's young. She's scared. She has nothing but a suitcase and a title to an old farmhouse her grandfather left her. The lawyers are trying to take it." Alina took a deep breath. "Tell her to wait for me. I'll be there in an hour." This was her life now. She wasn't just a woman with a secret. She was the person who helped others find their own strength. She used the resources Clara had left behind to ensure that no one else had to feel as small as she once did. But today was also a personal day. It was the anniversary of the day she found the oilskin pouch. She hopped into the Cadillac. The engine turned over with a deep, confident purr sound she had spent hundreds of hours perfecting with the help of local mechanics she now called friends. She drove through the town, waving at people who no longer saw her as the divorcee, but as the woman who had brought life. Back to the community, she drove to the cemetery on the edge of town. She walked past the grand marble monuments of the wealthy families, including the one her ex-husband belonged to, and headed toward a quiet, shaded corner under a large oak tree. There stood a simple, elegant headstone. It wasn't for a member of her own family. It was for Clara Moretti. Alina had worked for 3 years to have Clara's remains brought over from Italy to be buried near the legacy she had started. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the grass. "I hope you can see it now," Alina whispered. "The car is beautiful, the girl is safe, and the truth is finally out in the open." As she stood there, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see a woman in her late 30s holding the hand of a small child. The woman looked tired, but there was a spark in her eyes that Alina recognized instantly. It was the spark of someone who was starting to realize they were stronger than they had been told. "Are you the lady with the blue car?" the woman asked softly. Alina smiled. "I am. My grandmother told me about you," the woman said. "She said, if I ever felt like the world was closing in, I should look for the blue Cadillac. She said the woman who drives it knows how to fix things that are broken." Alina felt a lump in her throat. She realized that the story didn't end with her. The secret in the Cadillac wasn't just about money or evidence. It was about a chain of courage that passed from one woman to another across generations. Clara had started it in 1963. Alina had carried it through the modern day, and now she was passing the torch to someone else. She walked the woman and the child back to the car. She let the little girl sit in the driver's seat and honked the horn, the bright, brassy sound echoing through the quiet afternoon. "Where are we going?" the little girl asked. "To a place where you can start over," Alina said, looking at the mother. "A place where you get to decide who you want to be." As they drove away, the Cadillac moved effortlessly down the road. The tail fins caught the light, and for a moment, the car didn't look like an old relic from the past. It looked like the future. Alina looked at the empty passenger seat where the oilskin pouch had once sat. She didn't need the letters anymore. She didn't need the ledger. The secret was no longer hidden in the floorboards. It was written in the lives of every person she helped. The divorce had been a tragedy, but the Cadillac had been a miracle. And as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the highway, Lena Vance finally realized that she wasn't just the owner of a vintage car. She was the architect of her own destiny. The road ahead was long. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the curves or the hills. She had a full tank of gas, a clear head, and a heart that was no longer rusted shut. The morning mist was still clinging to the ground. When Alina pulled the Cadillac into the driveway of her childhood home, it had been years since she stood on this patch of grass. The house was small, the paint was peeling, and it looked nothing like the grand estate she now managed. But this was where everything began. She wasn't here to buy it back or to cry over the past. She was here because of a final letter she had found tucked deep inside the Cadillac seat cushions during a deep cleaning the week before. The letter wasn't from Clara. It was from her own father, written decades ago, and somehow it had found its way into the car's history before the car had even belonged to her. It was a strange coincidence of fate, perhaps a sign that some things are meant to find you when you are finally ready to handle them. She stepped out of the car, the door closing with that heavy, solid thud that only 1960s steel can make. She looked at the old porch swing, swaying slightly in the breeze. Her father had been a quiet man, a mechanic who spent more time talking to engines than to people. He had died just before she married the man who would eventually try to break her. For years, she thought her father had left her nothing but a few old tools and a handful of memories. But the letter she held in her hand told a different story. It spoke of a debt, not a debt of money, but a debt of honor. Her father had worked on this very Cadillac when it first arrived in the country. He had been the one to help Clara hide the ledger. He had never told Alina because he wanted her to have a normal life, free from the shadows of the powerful men who owned the town. "I saw the fire in you, even when you were a little girl," the letter read. "I knew that one day you would be the one to drive this car. Not as a passenger, but as the captain." Alina sat on the porch steps, the paper trembling in her hand. She realized that her destiny hadn't started with her divorce. It had started with a father who believed in her long before she believed in herself. He had helped Clara because he knew that one day a woman like Alina would need a way out. He had planted a seed in the form of a rusted-out car, knowing it would take decades to bloom. As she sat there, a car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a luxury SUV or a police cruiser. It was an old beat-up truck. An elderly man climbed out, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He looked at the Cadillac, then at Alina. "You must be the daughter," the man said, his voice like gravel. "I worked with your dad. He told me if I ever saw this car looking this good, it meant the world was finally right again." The man, whose name was Arthur, led Alina to the back of the property, to an old shed she had forgotten existed. Inside, covered in heavy canvas, were rows and rows of spare parts, original chrome, pristine light housing, and engine components for a 1961 Series 62. "Your father spent 20 years collecting these," Arthur said. "He knew you'd need them. He knew the world would try to wear you down, and he wanted to make sure you had the parts to put yourself back together." Alina walked through the shed, touching the cold metal. She felt a connection to her past that the divorce had almost severed. She realized that while her ex-husband had tried to build a life out of lies and theft, her father had built a life out of preparation and love. She spent the afternoon talking with Arthur, hearing stories about her father that she had never heard before. She learned that he had been a silent protector for many people in the town, using his skills to help those who had been pushed aside by the important people. He was the one who taught her, without words, that the most valuable things in life aren't the ones that shine. They are the ones that endure. When she finally got back into the Cadillac to drive home, she didn't just feel like a successful woman who had won a legal battle. She felt like a daughter who had finally understood her father's language. She drove back toward Clara's house, the sun setting behind her, casting a long, beautiful shadow of the Cadillac. Across the road, she realized that the secret mentioned in the title of her life wasn't just the ledger or the money in Switzerland. The secret was that she had always been enough. The car was just the tool she used to find that truth as she pulled into the driveway of the foundation. She saw the lights on in the windows. She saw the women she was helping, standing together, talking and laughing. She looked at the Cadillac, its peacock blue paint glowing in the twilight. She turned off the engine, but she didn't get out right away. She just sat in the silence, listening to the world. She had traveled across the ocean, faced down powerful men, and uncovered decades of corruption. But the greatest journey had been the few miles back to her childhood home, where she found the piece of herself she thought was lost forever. She was no longer the woman who was given a clunker as an insult. She was the woman who turned a ghost into a beacon. And as she finally stepped out of the car and walked toward the light of the house, she knew that the Cadillac's journey was over, but her own was just beginning.